Hello, everybody. Apologies for the wait. We had a few technical issues, but nevertheless, good things are worth waiting for, or so I'm told. Um, and also presumably all the latecomers are now here on time, which is, no bad thing either. So welcome everybody. Um, I usually say, oh, I'll just wait a few minutes to see if anyone else turns up late, but turns out that's me. So I guess I'm here. We can probably get started then. Thanks everyone for turning up. Um, I am just going to prepare myself and I'm going to give you uh, a talk, and it's going to be a few different things really. It'd be partly to introduce myself to you for those of you who don't know me. I hope that's some of you. I hope it just isn't full of people I know, although it's nice to see familiar faces. And I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction and make room for a discussion around psychedelics and altered states and what I call exceptional human experiences. And also to give you a plug and, well, not to give you a plug, to plug our program, Psychedelics, Altered States, and Transpersonal Psychology, and give you a bit of a taster of what might be involved in that course. And then we'll open it up for a big Q&A slash discussion slash debate slash interpretive dance moves, whatever you fancy, really. Hopefully some jokes. Not too many because I probably overdo it on the jokes. So I'm just trying to change the view on this. And that makes all the difference. Subtle, but powerful. Right. So, hello, everybody. I am Dr. David Luke. I am a psychologist by training and profession. It sounds a bit like a confession, really, actually, like perhaps being in the AA or something like that. But I wear a few different hats. I'm associate professor of psychology at the University of Greenwich. I wasn't until recently, I think, honorary, I don't know when, but honorary senior lecturer at Imperial College, where we have the Centre for Psychedelic Research, which used to be spearheaded by Robin, but is now no longer. Now David Ericso. There's a view of Greenwich from the air, very nice, right on the River Thames. And one of the things we do at the University of Greenwich is host, or was for many years, for about 10 years, the Breaking Convention Psychedelic Conference. It's now gone peripatetic and last seen Exeter, back in London in April. Europe's biggest psychedelic research conference. I'm one of the founders and now trustee of that organization. And when I'm not doing those things, and what I'm here to talk to you about tonight is the professional certificate in psychedelics, altered states, and transpersonal psychology at the Alef Trust, where I also teach on the master's course, what they do there on consciousness, spirituality, and transpersonal psychology. Lots of big words I hope to unpack. So first of all, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that program at the Alef Trust, the professional certificate. It's a one-year course, which starts in about a month's time or so, 5 or 6 weeks time. We're open for applications still for that program. It's a 1 year open to anybody online talk program covering everything to do with psychedelics, altered states, and transpersonal psychology. When we started it up about 4 years ago, it was pretty much only like two of the courses out there. And at that time, it was a pioneer. It's now in its fourth year. There are now, but this was like from 3 years ago. There was about 5 or 6 courses. There's now quite a lot of courses, it turns out, but we did address a particular niche in that we are a year-long taught online program, and it is indeed very reasonably priced compared to many of the others. So the program consists of 3 modules spread over the course of the year. The first one is to do with psychedelics and altered states. The second one is altered states and transpersonal psychology, which the program is very much embedded in. Alef Trust is an organization which educates about transpersonal psychology. And the final module is called Exploring Exceptional Human Experience, which I'm going to unpack for you a little bit. Exceptional experiences, not just the program. Now, the structure of the program is that the first two modules are taught, but they're very much interactive webinars, seminars, group activities, but some classic chalk and talk kind of education. And then the third module is either or both a kind of experiential and research focused project where people can kind of deep dive into their own particular altered states proclivities, be that shamanic drumming, breath work, ayahuasca retreats, or whatever it might be. There are many, many possibilities and options, and we've had a kind of whole plethora of fantastic different projects over the years. And which is going to be supervised by myself and the rest of the faculty, which is basically me and Pascal. And we bring our expertise to the fore and give you kind of one-to-one kind of supervision and tuition and guidance on a largely self-directed but supervised project, deep diving into some aspect of altered states or psychedelics and or transpersonal psychology. So this is the faculty. Myself and Pascal co-lead the program. Pascal Michael, who might be in here as well, is a member of the Alef Trust. Also, recently just finished his PhD at the University of Greenwich with me. So it turns out on near-death experiences and dimethyltryptamine, which are a fantastically interesting combination. I think you probably agree. And then we have various kind of guest lecturers come in and kind of adjunct faculty, if you like, and give kind of guest webinars throughout the year. Previous tutors include Dr. Roz Watts, clinical psychologist, expert on psilocybin for depression treatment, Maria Papasprou, who's a psychedelic integration therapist and the founder of the Institute for Psychedelic Psychotherapy in the UK, Akua Afosohini, who is a kind of grassroots activist and psilocybin enthusiast who works with kind of youth and inner city gangs and parents of children in gangs, and how kind of psychedelics may help in those situations. And then Professor Chris Batch, or Batch, I never know, it's Batch or Batch, you choose. He probably knows, is Professor of Religious Studies and wrote some really extraordinary books recently about his prolonged and very high dose LSD self experiments over the course of 10 or 20 years, exploring the kind of outer edges of philosophy and religion. All deep, fascinating stuff. So that's just kind of a taster of the kind of people we have on the program. I'm not going to just kind of wang on about the program, but there is going to be opportunity to ask any questions you may have about it at the end. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of psychedelics and altered states of consciousness, and what I call exceptional experience or exceptional human experience, which is generally this kind of stuff. Usually the things that you probably wouldn't see depicted on the back of a toilet door, but include things like, that looks like somebody running around with their head on fire, but I think it's actually reliably interpreted as Kundalini experiences, or perhaps, experiences of telepathy, or cosmic consciousness, or alien abduction experiences, or out-of-body experiences, near-death experience, so on and so forth. And it turns out that these kinds of extraordinary experiences tend to occur much more often in altered states of consciousness, particularly under the influence of psychedelics. And one of the kind of proto researchers and kind of godfathers of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, Stanislav Grof, spent many years documenting and cataloging these kinds of experiences on a daily basis in his work, and identified that there were three basic types of exceptional experiences that tend to occur with psychedelics. The first type of what we call the experiential extension within space-time and consensus reality. Those are those experiences which may seem extremely weird, but nonetheless do not defy anything we understand about the nature of reality according to mainstream science. So, for instance, that might include things like planetary consciousness, or at least experiences of planetary consciousness, or embryonal, fetal, and phylogenetic experiences. You know, those kinds of experiences where you feel like you have just regressed through, several million years or billion years of your own personal evolution, genetically speaking, and gone all the way back to the primordial ooze. Everyday experiences like that. The second category are what are called experiential extension beyond space-time and consensus reality. Those are experiences which, if taken at face value on the surface of it, seem to defy something we understand about the nature of reality according to mainstream science. And that is things like mediumship, or communication with spirits of the dead, or encounters with beings and cosmic consciousness, and so on and so forth. And then the final category are actually pretty rare, even with the most intense psychedelics, you might be reassured to know, and they are what Groff called transpersonal experiences of a psychoid nature, a term he nicked from Jung. And psychoids, according to Jung, is kind of the external manifestation of the inner kind of conscious experience. So things like UFOs, for instance, Jung called psychoids, but it might also include kind of psychokinesis or yogic siddhis, and so on and so forth. So these are the kind of experiences, just some of the many that tend to occur with psychedelics. I've been researching this area pretty much my whole career, including topics which touch on the kind of the soft end of exceptional experiences, or the least anomalous end of exceptional experiences, things like neurodivergence, like synesthesia, aphantasia, blindness, HPPD, hallucinogen persisting perceptual disorder, autism, and other neurodivergences, and how they intersect with psychedelics and altered states. And then more exotic phenomena like extra-dimensional percepts, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, entity encounters, alien abduction, sleep paralysis, interspecies communication experiences, possession, which occasionally happens, but not very often, thanatropy, that is the kind of feeling like you've been turned into or turning into another species, experiences of psi, telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance, and even occasionally psychokinesis, and of course, good old common or garden mystical experiences. Now, all of these things seem quite exotic phenomena, but do actually occur far more regularly, it turns out, once people gaze into their medicine bag for too long and start partaking of psychedelics. Luckily, you needn't do my course to find out more about them. But if you do, you will learn lots about these particular topics, so I can deep dive into them. Alternatively, and this is a kind of like a plug within a plug kind of talk. Alternatively, you can find a lot of that material in my book, Other Worlds, Psychedelics, an Exceptional Human Experience. So talking about kind of the rise of interest in psychedelics, we are in this current psychedelic research renaissance, which I'm not sure is even beginning to peak yet. It's possibly peaking, but it is still kind of expanding exponentially. And this is the most kind of concerted ever wave of interest and research in psychedelics, even more so than the 50s and 60s. That's been dormant for, of course, about 50 or 60 years as well because of prohibition. But we are now witnessing this kind of huge surge of reinterest in psychedelics, particularly within clinical science, medicine, psychology, psychiatry, and within the academy generally, but also very much culturally as well, and even legally as well. We're starting to see states in the States and nation states elsewhere around the world, finally, after many decades, changing their attitudes and legal status as regard to certain psychedelics, particularly plant psychedelics or fungal psychedelics like magic mushrooms, aka psilocybin, and so on and so forth. And that landscape is actually changing quite quickly, particularly within the very complex legal landscape within the States, which has both kind of state and federal laws to contend with. And that's just on the kind of legalization and decriminalization front. Meanwhile, there's been a kind of huge surge of interest and push towards the medicalization of these substances so that they can be used as licensed medicaments around the world. And that has just seen its kind of first successes almost exactly a year ago in Australia, where they announced that they were going to medicalize both psilocybin for the treatment of depression and MDMA for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. So with this kind of a watershed moment and kind of indicative, we think, of the way in which psychiatry is likely to change globally and begin to adopt psychedelics into its pharmacopoeia. So I'm going to talk a little bit broadly about psychedelics. Actually, I'm not going to go into too much detail because we had a bit of a late start already, and I'd like to just kind of open it up for questions and answers. But psychedelics are a diverse array or range of chemicals from plants, fungus, sometimes even animals as well. Constitute different varieties of chemical families such as tryptamines and phenethylamines, and there's a whole range of strange anomalies as well, which don't easily fit into any of those categories, and they seemingly work in various ways in the brain and work on different receptor sites as well. So I'm not going to get bogged down too much in the chemistry and neuroscience, but probably the easiest way or the most consistent way perhaps to define psychedelics might be by their psychological effects, how they change the person's state of consciousness or being, and that they can affect every dimension of our state of being, be it our kind of perception of time and space, our own body, our emotions, our perceptions, our thoughts, our feelings, all of it. Everything can kind of drastically change in a qualitative way on psychedelics in ways in which they don't on other psychoactive drugs. The chemistry and neurobiology is still far from fully understood, as is the psychology for that matter. Nevertheless, we do know a few things, and some of the major factors in understanding the kind of experiences people have under the influence of psychedelics are what we call set and setting, which you're probably familiar with. It's one thing to discuss the substance, the dosage, the purity, the structure, the purity. Did I say that already? The potency, the purity of the substance. But in terms of determining the kind of experience people are going to have, you have to think also about the set, i.e. the psychological framework that people bring to the experience, and the setting, the environment in which they take the substance. Those two things are probably equally, if not more important than the substance alone. And then, of course, there's always the ideas around preparation and integration, what happens before and after those experiences as well. Nevertheless, we can probably thank the rogue psychologist Timothy Leary for coming up with the notions of setting, and substance. That is a Harvard professor of psychology before he went, declared himself psychedelic high priest, turned blue as a consequence, and, got busted for cannabis, thrown in prison, busted out by the Black Panthers, went on the run, became public enemy number one, America's most wanted man, ended up in Afghanistan, got caught by the feds, dragged back to the States, thrown back in prison. But before all that, he did some good science. Bless Tim. But of course, if you don't pay attention to set and setting, there is potential risks of things that may be more likely to go wrong, what we used to call bad trips, which doesn't sound very scientific anymore. So we call them difficult or challenging psychedelic experiences or psychological experiences, which have been woefully understudied, in fact, until very recently. I am myself one of the researchers on a project called the Challenging Psychedelic Experience research project. We've just started publishing some papers on that, looking at that small minority of people who do suffer adverse consequences, psychologically speaking, from having psychedelic experiences. But generally speaking, the majority of people tend to report that they don't tend to have any long-term negative psychological consequences. Lots of people may have challenging experiences But whether or not these tend to kind of revert to long-term negative consequences still needs much more research. But that's one of the things we will probably touch upon on our course. Nevertheless, back in the 60s, it was said that if you take psychedelics or take LSD at least 3 times, you are by definition clinically insane. Now, we don't necessarily think that's true anymore. And in fact, the relationship between psychosis and the use of psychedelics is not well established. And we do now know that because there has been conducted some more thorough epidemiological research, which has surveyed, huge swaths of the general population and found that in large-scale samples, that if you look at people's entire drug use history and their psychiatric history, yes, there is a general relationship between the use of so-called recreational drugs and poor mental health, except for those people, it turns out, who've taken psychedelics, who, for instance, if you've taken in this survey, if you've taken LSD or psilocybin, you have lower incidence of psychological distress. And those people who took psilocybin also had lower 1 year use of psychiatric medication or inpatient treatment. And there's a graph just to show that. Nevertheless, in summary, it's now come to the point where if you were to do a risk-benefit analysis of the pros and cons of psychedelics as potential medicines within psychiatry, say, then they do and have been coming out quite favorably in that the risks of them are relatively low. They have relatively low risk of psychosis and suicide. Although there is a risk of course, adverse psychological reaction. In fact, most of the risks of psychedelics are psychological. They have very few physiological risks, classic psychedelics anyway, I'm talking about, like LSD and psilocybin. And they have very low toxicity. For instance, the number of people reportedly dying from psilocybin or LSD overdoses on an annual basis is precisely zero. So they have, extremely low toxicity. And we know that because unscrupulous drug smugglers have ingested large quantities with the intention of smuggling it across the border. That thing where you want to take some drugs on the plane, but you don't necessarily want to put them in your bag in case somebody finds them. So you might just, it's only a little amount, just wrap them up and swallow them and retrieve it later and everything be fine, except for that might not be such a good idea in the case of LSD because LSD is extremely potent. Just 1 gram, of course, is equivalent to 10,000 doses. So as this, you can fit that a gram in the small in my hand there. If you happen to be smuggling 7 grams of pure LSD, it might not be such a wise idea to wrap it up and swallow it, as did one drug smuggler. Badly, some might say. As it turns out, he got on the plane and having swallowed the said 7 grams, which then proceeded to open up inside him. Plane takes off, keeps flying, plane comes into land, something happened inside him, he carries on flying, 7 grams of LSD later, which is basically 70,000 doses of LSD later. I mean, the important thing about that story is it didn't kill him, which is astonishing, given that, 30 or 40 tablets of paracetamol can kill you. Nevertheless, he probably was tripping for a very long time. That's safe to say. Wow, what a trip. So we know that these things have very low toxicity. And so physiological risks, very low. Risks of psychosis and suicide, very low. However, there is genuine risk of psychological harm of other kinds, although we haven't fully established what the status of those risks is as yet. Dependency risks are also very low. People don't get addicted to psychedelics, it turns out, which is interesting and somewhat ironic based on the kind of current laws. For instance, in a recent kind of small-scale clinical trial, they used psilocybin to treat people for tobacco addiction. And that's one of the wonderful things about psychedelics is they're being used to treat other addictions. And they found that of those people who are given one high dose of psilocybin with a little bit of psychotherapy, and they followed them up for a year, and two-thirds of them abstained from smoking for the whole of that year, which is one of the most successful tobacco cessation treatment programs probably ever. And yet the irony is, of course, that certainly here in the UK, where I'm based, psilocybin is still a Class A Schedule 1 drug, which means you can get up to 7 years in prison just for possessing it, and up to a maximum of life imprisonment for supply or production. And yet it kills 0 people every year from overdose, and can get two-thirds of tobacco smokers potentially off smoking for at least a year. And when you think about that relative to tobacco, another psychoactive drug, the image is very different. Tobacco is legally available to anyone over the age of 18, and kills hundreds of thousands of people every year. And turns out it doesn't get you off your psilocybin addiction either. But then actually it wouldn't anyway, because people don't get addicted to psilocybin anyway. So, there's some kind of interesting kind of mismatches in the kind of legal status of these things. Anyway, moving on. Some of the other genuine risks are, of course, hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, which is a genuine risk, of course, from psychedelic usage. We don't know the actual prevalence rates of that either, but probably somewhere around, less than 1%. It has some parallels to visual snow syndrome, and may actually be a kind of drug-induced late adult onset version of visual snow syndrome, but there's still some more research to be done in that area. But it is a genuine risk. Nevertheless, there are benefits as well, and it seems that the risks are probably outweighed by the potential benefits of the use of psychedelics within psychiatry and perhaps in other areas of medicine as well. And you're probably all aware, or you wouldn't be in here, of the various news stories and scientific papers being coming out demonstrating the potential benefits of psychedelics in treating all manner of psychiatric conditions, such as end-of-life existential fear and depression, anxiety that concomitant with people who have stage 4 cancer, et cetera, et cetera. And in those studies, the success rates again have been quite extraordinary. To give you an example, in this one study, they had something like about two-thirds of the participants in that study, after one high dose of psilocybin, had complete remission of their depressive symptoms up to 6 months later, much like that kind of golden figure again, two-thirds, similar to the tobacco cessation treatment program. So the results of these studies are usually quite astonishing, but what we find fairly consistently, and this is kind of bringing it back to the exceptional experiences side of things, is that whenever these studies are conducted, if they were to measure what we call the mystical experience or the spiritual experience, which they commonly do, particularly in the States, they always tend to find that the mystical experience is always related to clinical outcomes. So in that one study, for instance, depression scores were related to the intensity of the mystical experience itself. We find the same thing in the tobacco cessation study as well. Very strong relationship between scores on the mystical experience questionnaire, which is kind of quite an abstract concept that, as scientists, we like to measure anything and everything, including really esoteric concepts like the mystical experience, which is a bit hard to grasp ordinarily anyway. But nevertheless, all these studies, clinical trials, be it with treatment of tobacco addiction, or in this case, alcohol addiction, find very nice relationships between the intensity of the mystical experience and clinical outcomes. And we find that pretty much in every study that's being conducted, and hence the relevance and importance of kind of bracketing the psychedelic experience within what we call transpersonal psychology. And transpersonal psychology is a study of those experiences which take us beyond our normal everyday ego identity, going transpersonal. Excuse me. So, or what we might otherwise call exceptional human experiences. Uh, they're quite hard to define, although this slide obviously works quite well, but there's the actual mystical experience scale. So typically the mystical experience is conceptualized as having four major scales, the first of which is called the mystical experience, which includes a sense of internal and both external unity with everything, the universe, yourself, and everything in it. It has a noetic quality, which feels like a sense of understanding the true nature of the universe. There is also a sense of the sacredness. And the other three factors are long-lasting positive mood, feelings of bliss, awe, ecstasy, compassion, love, all that good stuff, transcendence of time and space, and the sense of the ineffable, that you've somehow touched or kind of engaged with something that you can't actually put into words. Now, I'm going to open this up to Q&A in a minute, but I just want to loop this around and it's not just all about psychedelics either. I mean, psychedelics, I think, are really just a special case of an altered state of consciousness. That is one induced by pharmacological or kind of chemical or plant-based means, right? You by ingesting some kind of external substance, but all altered states, I believe, take us to very similar places. Psychedelic altered states just happen to be somewhat more reliable. Although, and I've done research kind of like using the same tools that we use to map the altered state of the psychedelic experience, and also using those to map non-drug induced altered states of consciousness. Now, it turns out that the psychedelic induced altered states of consciousness are a little bit what we call heterogeneous, in that they have the very strong flavors in the various kind of dimensions you could plot it in, as here along these 11 dimensions of unity experience or spiritual experience or complex imagery or simple imagery and so on. And yet, they kind of tend to occupy a lot of this kind of the variance in these dimensions. So these are intense kind of subjective experiences. But when you look at the non-drug induced variety, as I've been doing, looking at maybe people in flotation tanks or doing holotropic breath work or in Ganzfeld rooms or in anechoic darkroom chambers, we see that the kind of patterns of the form of their altered state is much more homogeneous, in fact. And so there is a tendency to kind of underpin this by saying that, all altered states in a way have very similar phenomena in terms of the kind of experiences that we have. And that is gives rise to some all manner of interesting philosophical and practical discussions, which I'm not going to have right now. But what else we got here? Oh yeah, and then we also compared those to spontaneous spiritual experiences that people have had, which there's the kind of the bigger blue line, very nicely map to the broader range of non-drug induced altered states, but just happen to have the kind of magnitude at which they happen, have the dial turned up, particularly along these kind of more spiritual dimensions. And then we kind of back map these to find the best fit with kind of non-drug induced or psychedelic experiences. And it turns out spontaneous spiritual experiences tend to map very nicely to DMT induced mystical experiences, such that there is perhaps some sense in which DMT, this really super intense psychedelic that is naturally occurring in the human body, could potentially help us understand or explain or account for those experiences when people spontaneously have these kind of spiritual awakenings. Anyway, I am going to wrap all of this up more or less around about here and leave you with a beautiful image of my book. And I'd like to open it up for just any questions or discussion or anything really, even interpretive dance moves. Thank you. Uh, there's a link at the top of the chat. Question from Yorgos. Theranthropy. That is, thank you. Georgios or Yorgos. I don't know how you say it. If you're still there, Theranthropy is these kind of like half human, half animal kind of hybrid, like werewolves and things like that. I'm not talking about actual werewolves, but it turns out that it's a very common experience, at least within the kind of shamanic worldview perspective. And that's one thing I didn't really talk about, and that's one thing we always cover on our program is the traditional indigenous use of psychedelics around the world, which has of course gone on far longer than our Western scientific endeavors, which has been around for about the last 100 years. There's evidence of indigenous practices and uses of psychedelics elsewhere in the world going back up to 8 to 10,000 years. In some cases, such as the use of San Pedro mescaline-containing cactus in the Andes. And in many of those cases, in traditions, in fact, like very much at the root of Amerindian cosmologies and epistemologies of people who use psychedelics in a shamanic context, people transform in their belief system into other things, other species, plants, animals, waterfalls, whatever it is. It's a very common part of their worldview that there is this kind of possibility to transform into other things. And it turns out that's also a relatively common experience that even Westerners will have with psychedelics. And it seems very alien to our particular worldview. And it's obviously in our worldview, it's completely hallucinatory experience. And yet in Amerindian cosmology, that's the very route by which you come to understand things. It underpins not just their cosmology, but their epistemology, how they come to obtain knowledge. If you want to understand something in the Amerindian world, you turn into that thing to understand it. And you do that through altered states of consciousness. And so the Theranthrope or Theranomorph, there's kind of half human, half animal or half plant hybrids we see in ancient temple engravings all across the Americas, etc., and all across the world are indicative of these transformationary experiences. You didn't actually ask that question, Yorgos, but I hope it answers the question you might have answered. David, great info. Well, UFO, not really part of it. I mean, that was one of the things Young brought in. And Groff also kind of chose to try and explain UFOs in the context of psychoids. But there hasn't been much research done into it, David. But yeah, I would hazard a guess that there is probably a greater likelihood to have UFO sightings or encounters during or after psychedelic experiences. But that needs some more research. But it's not a kind of the main thrust of the psychedelic research endeavor, generally speaking. Thanks, Roy. Scott had a question. Hi, Scott. Something to do with you're making films. I don't know if this is a question. It looks like a very long question if it is. Interesting how filming could be utilized to deliver, potentiate a non-intrusive method for healing. Well, absolutely. This looks like a more of a longer discussion. We might come back to that. Yorgos is back. Thero means beast. It does indeed. Thank you. And Yorgos is back again. I feel like I'm having a conversation with you. Is it different from shapeshifting? Well, actually, so Theranthropy is a kind of like a consequence of shape shifting. I posit, and others have as well. Um, Jay, I've always tried to put these experiences into words. People just laughed and then thought of me as mad triphead. Well, yeah, that's kind of traditionally how these things are framed. Um, I gave up trying to explain, but the stuff you've covered here do a good job of explaining it. It's definitely changing stuff when you cross onto the other inexplicable dimension state. This is actually kind of well documented that, what happens when people have psychedelics and have these exceptional experiences is, they tend to lose their shit to begin with, right? In that they have these extraordinary experiences which doesn't fit within their worldview. Um, eh, None of their friends or family particularly can get their head round. And there's various stages that people go through in this kind of process of integrating these extraordinary experiences or exceptional experiences. And one of the first stages is that, have I gone mad? That's kind of one of the first steps in any kind of exceptional experience induced by psychedelics or otherwise, is people have a sense where they begin to question their own sanity first and foremost. And then they start doing a deeper search for meaning, start looking at courses like this, reading literature, Googling stuff on the internet, which fortunately you can do now, but was, less available back in the day, and beginning to kind of try and understand their experience. And that may lead them down various pitfalls of seeking out gurus or becoming a megalomaniac or spiritual bypassing, and thinking they're suddenly special and not looking at their own kind of intrapersonal issues and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of well documented kind of path that people tend to go along when they've had an exceptional experience, and the first stage of which is commonly, yeah, you just people laugh at you if they don't have an openness or an understanding of these experiences. And then what happens if the people around you don't tend to understand, is that people will often move away from the people they traditionally would embrace in their kind of milieu. So these experiences can often lead to people changing their entire lifestyle, of the result of the fact that people around them may not have a very good understanding of it. Now, it's a classic adage that you have a psychedelic experience, you go away on a retreat or whatever, and take ayahuasca and have all these amazing revelations and insights and get your mind completely blown, and then come back and people typically act upon those revelations and insights and journeys, and quit their jobs, leave their partner, sell their house within a few days of returning from a retreat. Not always such a good idea. I mean, they may ultimately be good ideas, but it's usually advised that you don't immediately act on your psychedelic experiences. You give them time to kind of integrate. But it is well known that psychedelics and other exceptional experiences can be extremely worldview shifting. We see kind of huge shifts in people's metaphysical beliefs, in their spiritual beliefs, in how they relate to nature and the natural world, how much consciousness they ascribe to non-human animals and objects. For instance, DMT, which I mentioned, when people take DMT at high doses, they very commonly have encounters with beings they interpret to be real, sentient, other than them, intelligent beings, which they also feel are more real than this world. And they can be very kind of worldview shattering experiences, so much so. And then a survey done recently at one of the leading medical universities in the States, they found of those people who'd taken DMT and had an encounter experience, of those that were atheists before their experience, less than half of them remained atheist afterwards, right? So this is kind of a 10-minute psychedelic experience, which can convert more than half of all atheists into non-atheists in the space of 10 minutes. So these can be extremely profound worldview shattering experiences, which your chums down the pub or your football team or whatever might not necessarily understand. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Uh, you're certainly not automatically bonkers, Jay. Oh, there's more questions or more comments at least. I shall go try and chug through these. Matthias, are there any studies about how psychedelics influence the energy system of the body, Kundalini, microcosmic orbit, etc., and the long-term effects on that? Well, not actual studies per se, in terms of, scientific research papers. Um, no, there isn't. I'd say there's a kind of strong relationship between Kundalini and psychedelic experiences in that we see a lot of people experimenting with psychedelics have spontaneous kind of Kundalini experiences. They can certainly be a trigger of Kundalini experiences, particularly in those people unsuspecting that, aren't expecting to suddenly have a Kundalini awakening and have no idea what they are. So yeah, there's a relationship and overlap between psychedelic experiences and Kundalini experiences, but how it affects the energy system of the body is an open question, and deserves more study. That could be an interesting project for our program in the module 3. I'll leave that with you. Leah, there have been studies completed that compare the clinical setting for being in a building to those of being in nature that you're aware of. Thank you. So in terms of psychedelic experiences, it's interesting in that there has been some kind of naturalistic studies looking at people before they go to a retreat center, and looking at their connection to nature. And then after the psychedelic experience, they're much more connected to nature as a consequence. But we also find even in a clinical drug trial center in a laboratory, when people have psilocybin for treating depression, for instance, we also find an increase in people's connection to nature. Um, uh, so like even despite the setting being completely clinical, it's our guess, and we put forward a proposal in a paper in Health Psychology Open. If you read that journal, shame on you if you don't. That we would expect that people taking psychedelics in more natural environments are probably more likely to have a greater increase in their connection to nature as a result of being in a forest or a woodland, or they're much the same things, or next to a waterfall or next to a river. And we propose that actually, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy would be better in kind of natural environments, because it's like to make people feel more connected to nature. And as a consequence, the more connected to nature you are, the better it is for your long-term mental health and well-being, because you're going to spend more time in nature because you're more connected to it. And the more time you spend in nature reduces your anxiety. And the more time you want to spend in nature, it's better for your physical and mental health, and so on and so forth. So it's got a positive feedback loop, which we've proposed in a recent paper that we should be doing this. But it hasn't taken off yet, not least because because of the legal status of psychedelics currently, and they're not even being widely used medicinally. But that's a really good point. We do think there is probably some moderating factors of environment in terms of the kind of experiences people have. Ivana, I have a few questions. Is if this is fantastic. You've got questions about the program. Is the fee for the certification paid all at once? It can actually be paid in tranches, I think, in 3 tranches. Is that right, Nick? Nick might be able to chime in on this.
It's in 2, and I already did answer that in the following question about the PhD.
Ah,
It's in there.
brilliant. Thank you for that, Nick. Okay, so Nick's answered those questions. Um, how prevalent are altered states of consciousness without taking psychedelics? Uh, in what way do you think these are similar to psychedelic-based altered states of consciousness? What is the link between visual snow? Oh, that was a good question. So, well, how prevalent are altered states of consciousness without taking psychedelics? I mean, I mean, it depends. I mean, everybody dreams, for instance, right? Well, unless perhaps you've had a stroke or you smoke too much cannabis or even just smoke cannabis regularly. There is no too much necessarily, but like, cannabis kind of ruins your dream recall. But so, potentially we're all having altered states of consciousness on a daily basis or a nightly basis, more or less. So it's not easy to kind of necessarily answer that question. Uh, but we don't necessarily pay much attention to those states of consciousness that we get for free, like dreaming. Interestingly, the anthropologist and neurophenomenologist Charles Laughlin proposed this idea that we in the West, in the developed world, or whatever we want to call it, the global North, are what he called a monophasic culture, and that is we only really value the waking state of consciousness, whereas pretty much the rest of the world are what he called polyphasic cultures in other indigenous cultures and around the world, and that is they value numerous states of consciousness, be it dreaming or psychedelic experiences or kind of trance states from drumming or dance or whatever it might be. In our kind of collective wider culture, we only really value the waking state of consciousness, with some concessions perhaps for being caffeinated to make you kind of more productive at work, and perhaps getting drunk on a Friday night as a way to relax from a hard week of work. But generally speaking, so yeah, everybody dreams, and yet we don't necessarily pay very much attention to those three states of consciousness that we get, which personally I find as illuminating and numinous and mystical as psychedelic experiences, if you happen to pay attention. Now, they take a bit more work because you've got to train yourself to remember your dreams and document them and take time to do that in a way in which it's probably easier just to go to a retreat center and drink a cup of ayahuasca, right? And it's just kind of have the waking dream on demand. So we have access to what states of consciousness of all types all the time. And I do think they are very similar in that all the exceptional experiences you can have in non-psychedelic states, we also get in psychedelic states and vice versa. Things like out-of-body experiences of telepathy, mystical experiences, they occur equally in altered states of consciousness that aren't induced by psychedelics. I think the psychedelic altered states are just more reliable and more intense. But we have the same kind of array of exceptional experiences available to both. And then finally, your question about visual snow is particularly in relationship to what's called HPPD, hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, what people used to call flashbacks. And some people do suffer from, perhaps less than 1% of all psychedelic users. And visual snow syndrome is a new syndrome, only got given a name 5 or 6 years ago. But the symptoms of visual snow syndrome look very much like HPPD. And so the idea is that HPPD, what we call flashbacks and etc., is probably people who have an underlying propensity to develop visual snow. Maybe they got members in their family had visual snow, or it's probably to some extent genetically inherited, but don't actually manifest it on a conscious level. If they take drugs, and not just psychedelics, I have to say, HPPD can be caused by non-psychedelic drugs as well, but more slightly induced by LSD. They then kind of tips them over the threshold where they start manifesting visual snow, but because they don't know what it is, it is kind of quite disturbing. And what we find is it usually takes a couple of years for people to habituate to this kind of change in perceptual style. And we haven't done the research as yet, but myself and one of my brilliant students last year or the year before, we got together all the experts on visual snow syndrome and the experts on HPPD who'd never really spoken to each other, and we got them all in a room together for a day. And the amount of overlap of these two syndromes was quite extraordinary. So, but it needs more research to back up our theory that HPPD is actually just a type of visual snow syndrome. Claire, what is my view on Terence McKenna's stoned ape theory? I love this one. What's my view on Terence McKenna's stoned ape theory? Right, we've got a bit of time. I'm going to let this run till about half past. So we've got about another 20 minutes. Uh, for those of you who don't know, does anybody um, know Terence McKenna's stoned ape theory? I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. Uh, but Terence, bless his little cotton socks, about 30 years ago now, he put forward let's call it a theory or hypothesis that something happened in kind of human evolution, what, 200,000 to a million years ago, where there's a kind of huge step, well, about 200,000 years ago, we've been kind of hominids or humans for about a million years. And then at some point, there's this kind of huge step up in kind of evolution, which is exhibited by our shifts in kind of in culture and stone use and tool use and fire, et cetera, et cetera. In that, the first signs of human art, what, 70 to 100,000 years ago, et cetera, et cetera. But basically something happened in a very short space of time, evolutionarily speaking, which made humans kind of advance quite drastically and depart from their primate cousins. And so Terence McKenna suggested that our ancient ancestors on the savannas of Africa were looking for foodstuffs. There's some mushrooms growing. You just pick up and eat and try anything until it poisons you. And of course, they picked up some magic mushrooms, and our kind of ancient ancestor, Thrug, let's call him, picking up magic mushrooms, and then he kind of consumed them and thereby gave rise to language, perhaps through the principle that psychedelics like psilocybin reliably induce experiences of synesthesia, that is a blending of the senses. And so, Thrug quite literally could see what he was saying. He'd go ugh, 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 and like ugh would come out of his mouth and be kind of visible, but ugh would look like a stone or a rock, and from that point on, rocks were now called ugh. So that the idea that synesthesia is one of the origins of language development. There is actually kind of a good non-psychedelic theory to support that. That language evolution came about through synesthesia. So Terence McKenna suggested that's how language came about in this kind of huge cognitive leap. He also suggested, because it had to be kind of evolutionarily adaptive and selected for, he had to say that he also said it made our ancestors hypersexual as well. So they were more likely to breed if they'd eaten the magic mushrooms, and therefore magic mushroom eating behavior, and therefore the development of language became selected for. Now, we don't actually have any data on whether or not psilocybin makes humans hypersexual. I'd be interested to hear from anybody who does have any data on that, personal or otherwise, but privately, preferably. But in terms of like what happens with cicadas, interestingly, we do know a little bit, and that is there are a type of cicada, these kind of little crickets or whatever you call them, locusts, or that have 7 or 11 year cycles, but some of them, when they kind of go to ground and hibernate or develop over this kind of 7 year pupation stage, or 11 years, some of them have been infected with fungus, a type of fungus, I believe called, is it Massospora? It is Massospora. I just asked myself. And what happens is when the cicadas emerge, those that have been infected by the Massospora fungus have had their entire back end, including their genitals, completely devoured by the fungus and replaced with a kind of really low-grade fungus version of the back end of a body. And then the fungus, like when they kind of pop out and start flying around and they all start kind of mating, the fungus injects them with both amphetamines and psilocybin, which it produces, and makes them hypersexual. And the cicadas basically go around dry humping all the other cicadas and infecting them with the fungus, and they turn into zombie cicadas. So basically, that's the only evidence we have that that psilocybin makes you hypersexual and therefore is evolutionarily adaptive and selected for. It's a bit tenuous, but it is a good story. And it also points out the fact that, you know, if in our kind of growing relationship with nature and with fungus and with psychedelic fungus in particular, uh, like we're probably at this kind of juncture where there's an opportunity here for a kind of symbiosis or whereby we can be mutually beneficial to each other. And if we don't, if we don't go down this path of kind of stopping trashing the planet, as the mycologist Paul Stamets says, then that might be the direction in which it goes. In that we get turned into zombies, by fungus because they're very easily capable of doing this kind of parasitism. So I think we're at a kind of critical evolutionary juncture here where we're being offered some possible ways of relating to the natural world. And if we don't, then, that way it might all end up. So that's an interesting take on the stoned ape hypothesis. What I will say is myself and a colleague from Oxford, Devon, did some of the only research in the last 15, 20, 30, 40 years, in fact, looking at synesthesia and psychedelics. And we found that, yes, psychedelics do reliably induce synesthesia. The most common type of synesthesia they induce is seeing sound, it turns out. And so that does actually support somewhat this idea of the stoned ape theory. And we also found that actually, in some cases, although it seems relatively rare, some people can have permanently changed, like they may acquire permanent synesthesia from taking psychedelics. In that instead of it just being an acute experience whilst you're tripping, you end up with it for the rest of your life, which in and of itself can be quite challenging for a couple of years till you habituate. But again, supports this idea of the stoned ape theory for the origins and evolution of language coming about through psychedelics. So thanks for that question, whoever that was. I think we've got time for a few more. I've just lost the chat box though now. I've no idea where it's gone. Where's my chat box gone? I don't know what I've done here. I'm gonna have to make the questions up. No, I can't do that. Where's the chat box? I don't know what I've done here. Oh no, everyone's disappeared. Oh, here it is. There it is. I do take it. Okay. Can you please say more about module 3? Oh, I like this. It's kind of, we're jumping around quite a lot here. This is great. So module 3 on our program. So the first two modules are much more taught. It's going to give you a bit of grounding in altered states and psychedelics. The second module will move more into this kind of realm of transpersonal and exceptional experiences, which I think it's really important that anybody working with psychedelics currently needs to be grounded in the full spectrum range of experiences that you may be likely to encounter. And it is quite broad. And, a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of the range of experiences that are possible and so on and so forth. And then the third module is going to be less kind of group work and less taught, and it's going to be a personal project. And so people kind of choose throughout the course of the previous two modules, they start to develop an idea of which direction they want to go in. So to give you an idea, some people have done ecstatic dancing for dealing with personal grief. Somebody's father died. Another one of the students was looking at the use of shamanic drumming in helping them deal with epilepsy, which they'd just been diagnosed with. One of my students currently has just spent 2 weeks locked in his well, not locked in, but in a cabin in the Arctic Circle, doing a dark retreat. So many other different projects that people have done. They can also be kind of research based as well. So it need not just be experiential. So some students have done kind of classic like surveys of the benefits of taking psychedelics at festivals. That's now just been accepted as a paper in a scientific journal, the Journal of Psychedelic Studies, and that students given talks at psychedelic conferences around the world, because she did such an extraordinary job of filling a gap in the research that was there in finding out who takes psychedelics at festivals and for what purposes and what the benefits and risks might be. So it could be a kind of classic research kind of project as well, if you're that way inclined. And of course, because this is transpersonal psychology, which we rather love, it can be a combination of both. So there's kind of research methods which you don't find elsewhere in science, like intuitive inquiry, which use the your own personal experience as the kind of the springboard or the starting block for a research project, which, you begin with the inquiry of what is the question, what do I actually want from this project, and then you may go off and say read some literature and then interview relevant people. So I've had students doing projects on that, looking at what is the role of psychedelics in ecotherapy, for instance, and what direction should that go in? And the student came at it from their own personal quest, and then we'll help them find various people in psychedelics and ecology and ecotherapy, and they went off and interviewed those, and then they brought it all back, and you come back in full circle and like, how do I relate to that? What have I learned on this personal quest? So it's both experiential and research based often in these projects. And there's many, many more projects that we've had, all of which are quite extraordinary. And then there's a kind of written report that the students produce at the end of it. But there's also, we put on a kind of 1-day conference for all the students, and they present their project findings. They're given a half-hour slot each, and they're able to just talk about their research in a more direct way. But we also very much encourage a kind of creative approach to that. So we've had students make kind of like films, mini documentaries. We've even had people do rap or kind of paint and create music and all kinds of stuff. So there is a kind of classic kind of academic scholarly track to it, and a more kind of creative one in that third module, as well as a kind of experiential and research as well. It gives you a whole kind of gamut of tools. And ultimately, the style in which you write the report needn't be just a kind of classic scholarly kind of write-up. In some cases, I've just had 2 students combine their project together, and we submitted the paper to a journal. But in other cases, students may want to write in a more journalistic way or a more personal way. It could be that they might want to ultimately adapt their written work for a blog or Substack or whatever they want. Or some students made educational materials and went on to start psychedelic transpersonal organizations themselves, it turns out. So there's very many directions in which you can take it. It's very broad, very open, and it's basically anything under the umbrella of alt states and psychedelics and transpersonal psychology. Myself and Pascal have a wealth of experience and knowledge in this area and can supervise pretty much anything within the bounds of feasibility. So long as it's nothing multi-dimensional, we should be all right, pretty much. I hope that answers that question. What else? Well, I've got a few more questions there on the chat. So 2 installments. Oh yeah, thanks. That's the question. I'm just going backwards here. Finn, Cat. What's my own personal view of OBEs in relation to the current theories, approaches of consciousness, idealism, panpsychism, dualism, cosmopsychism, zero-point field, etc.? Do I think OBEs align to one particular theory approach or a mixture? From my own view, seeing OBEs more of a psyche nature in the words of Jung, psyche is simply world, individualism, and collective. So more cosmovision. Well, that's a kind of big question there. In terms of OBEs, you're talking about out-of-body experiences. And I think, the theories around out-of-body experiences are, I mean, it's not well understood, first of all. The psychological approaches to it have been but poorly defined. So, there's lots of researchers out there saying, oh, we can explain out-of-body experiences in terms of anomalies at the temporal parietal junction in the brain, because if you apply transcranial magnetic stimulation to people, you can induce out-of-body experiences at that point in the brain. And yet, actually, when you look into it, those out of body experiences aren't really like the natural kind of out of body experiences people have spontaneously in hypnagogic states, in meditation, or whatever. So it's like the research in the world of out of body experiences is like, even though we've known about these things for over 100 years in the academy, it's still kind of like, it's still very nascent. It's very early days, and it's kind of like nobody's even really sure what they mean when they talk about out of body experiences half the time, other than it's the experience of, having your consciousness. It feels like you're experiencing your consciousness leaving your body. I'd like to see, personally, I don't really have any kind of hard theories on anything. I try to be agnostic. I try and be open to all possible explanations and not get fixated on any one. Because I think, as soon as we do get stuck on any one particular theory or belief about anything, that closes the door on everything else. So I try and be agnostic and open-minded on all this phenomena as much as I can. And that behooves me to do that because I'm trying to bridge the world of science and shamanism and mediumship and the occult and magic and all these different things. And I think, I don't want to just be standing solely in any one of those universes. This is also a bit of a cop-out, but I think we should be open to the idea that there is a genuine split between consciousness and the body when we have an out-of-body experience. I mean, they do lead to the personal experience of thinking dualistically, like that mind and body are separate. And in my own experiences of having out-of-body experiences, that seems kind of very apparent. For instance, whilst experimenting with DXM, which I happened to get in Benylin cough mixture, I'd accidentally drank too much. Semi-accidentally, I have to say, somewhat experimentally. And then trying to get into the toilet, I couldn't get through the door. And then I looked and I found my body standing about 5 or 6 feet to the left of me. But I was trying to go through the door from a disembodied perspective, 6 feet to the right. And when you have that kind of experience of like genuinely not being able to walk through a doorway because you're not where you thought you were, and then you see your body, and that's when you realize you're having an out-of-body experience. It kind of leads you to think that you're having a genuinely dislocated experience, like your visual perception is actually coming from a disembodied perspective, and none of the kind of ordinary brain-based explanations are really sufficient in kind of accounting for that kind of phenomena. I won't tell you what happened when I did get into the toilet, because you try going to the, it's bad enough being a man going to the toilet, but try and go into the loo when your actual consciousness is like 6 feet outside the toilet cubicle. It wasn't a happy ending, I tell you. So let's move on and have another question. Claire, with the psychedelic renaissance, have you had resistance from the academic world or the opposite? Do you know what? I thought there would be a lot more resistance to it. And in my career, in the early days, I very much kept my interest in psychedelics quiet. When I started my PhD, I wanted to do something on psychedelics, but you couldn't even find a supervisor anywhere in the UK to supervise a project. It was still a massive taboo subject. And it's transformed into this kind of hot button topic now. But I kind of outed myself, came out of the closet by putting on this kind of massive psychedelic research conference at my university. And I hadn't really told my colleagues about what my research interests really were. And then the guy in the university media department got hold of it and decided to splash it all over the front page of the university webpage. And suddenly, like, all my colleagues were like, they knew what I was interested in. And I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting. And I thought, there'd be a lot of pushback. There wasn't anybody who gave me any criticism or ostracization or anything. And in fact, the opposite happened. But in private, people would come to my office. I'd get this little at the door, and people would look both ways and then stick their head around the door and go, oh, this conference you're doing looks really interesting. Did I ever tell you about the time that ... And I got that from like half of my colleagues, but they all thought they were the only one. They were all kind of coming in private, hoping nobody else spots them, like talking about psychedelics. So, and I think it's moved on quite a lot from that point as well. So there is very little resistance. In fact, I've had almost, zero resistance to my research interest in psychedelics, and a lot of support, especially privately, and increasingly publicly as well. So I think we really have turned a corner here. I am going to draw it to a close there because the evening is drawing on. You can drop myself an email if you didn't get to your question. I'm going to put my email address in here. I'm just going to put my generic one in. And I will do my best to answer your questions. Meanwhile, thank you everybody for coming. Apologies for our late start. And I hope that if anybody has particularly queries about the program or the course, do drop us a message. Applications are open for the next 5 or 6 weeks, and we are happy to answer any questions about that. But if you've got any more questions more generally relating to the talk, do zap them over to me, and I will zoop off to bedtime now. Thank you, everybody. Lovely to see some of you, and thanks for coming along. Good night or good morning.